pleasure to be in front of you this morning as we share a little bit of our time with Dr. Tatum. So the thing that I would say as a point of personal privilege in being here is that I want to give you a little bit of a sense of my relationship with Dr. Tatum by way of introduction. You can certainly read her bio. Many of you know something about Dr. Tatum as she was president of what college? Spelman College. Yes. I'm a graduate, so this is sort of a dream come true to be up here at work and a school that I'm very passionate about. So I don't know if you know this, but I first met Dr. Tatum as she was one of the finalists in the running for the presidency of Spelman. And through that process, we had alum that were sort of the final having conversation, getting to understand your vision. And we're a tough crowd. We feel like, you know, our college should have an alum. And I was so impressed with your vision for our college, and I learned that you were a woman of words. You talked about Spelman being a jewel that needed a little bit of polishing, and I loved how you sort of provoked us to talk about our school in a way that was positive, but yet you owned that there were some things we need to do. So that was my first introduction. Then I got to know you as my client because she's a risk taker, and before I came to Purpose Built, I had my own consulting practice, and you were looking to do a number of things, the leadership conference and your strategic plan, and you took a chance on me. And just like Spelman took a chance on me and really set a foundation for me, that project and working with you accelerated my business and opened up doors that I hadn't imagined. And so that was sort of my second piece. But through that work, and this is what I think is really important for us in the room today, is I got to know you as a transformational leader. I cannot tell you all the wonderful things that Dr. Tatum did during her time at Spelman, but just to name a few, during that planning process, and this is why I'm such a fan of strategic planning, is you helped us see we were global citizens, and so now almost all of 100% of the students at Spelman have some kind of global experience before they leave the college. You had a $150 million campaign, which people didn't think that we could do, and you exceeded that goal. You have a gold LEED certified building on campus, which is named after you. So she just did amazing things for our college. And so lastly, I know this is a little bit of a long introduction, but she's so dear to my heart, you became my friend. And when I was talking to David about making my shift to Purpose Built, you were one of the first people I called. And so either you all can be very happy about that, or you can blame her about that. But you were very supportive, and you helped me see that this was a great path for you. So I say all those things to say I am so excited about this morning to talk with you a little bit about Dr. Tatum's book. But please join me in welcoming my friend and the person who will always be my president, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum.
Thank you.
So when we started talking about this session, you were telling me a little bit about some things that were going on with you since you no longer at Spelman. And that phrase you used was hungry but hesitant. Share with our audience a little bit of sort of why we named the session this and sort of how that came about.
Sure. Well, let me begin by saying I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank you, Michelle, for that lovely introduction. And we were talking about this session, and I was talking about my experience this spring at Stanford. I spent the spring as a distinguished visitor at Stanford, and people asked me, well, what do you do as a distinguished visitor? And I said, you visit, which is to say, I visited a lot of classrooms. I spoke to lots of students. I spoke to faculty. I was meeting with groups over lunch, dinner, lots of eating. And but what was very interesting about that experience was people wanted to talk with me because they know I write about race. And they were very eager to have a conversation about race, particularly in today's context. And yet, when I arrived at the classroom or in the session, people wanted to hear me talk, but they didn't want to talk. And so that's what I meant when I described them as an audience, as both hungry, as in hungry for the conversation, but hesitant, as in hesitant to really have to do the talking themselves. And I think that it is a very common description of many of the audiences I've had the experience with, maybe even this one, in the sense that many people know that this is an important conversation, we need to have it, and yet there's a lot of hesitation about it.
Yeah. So take us back 20 years. I know you can hardly believe that it's been that long since you first wrote the book, and the name of the book, I didn't say it in the introduction, but it's certainly in the, your materials, is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race? So take us back to 1997, and why did you feel it was important to write this book?
Well, let me just say, so people may be wondering, well, why is she talking about 1997? I wrote this book originally in 1997, and the edition that Michelle is holding on her lap is the 20th anniversary edition that just came out a few weeks ago in September. And so in 1997, I was a faculty member. I'm a psychologist, and I was teaching a course on the psychology of racism, which of course is, that course I started teaching in 1980. So by that time, I'd been doing it 17 years, and I was doing a lot of workshops around the country. One of the things that I observed in my classroom was that my students, often juniors and seniors in college when they took my class, would say, you know, this course is so powerful and it's such an important topic, and I can't believe that I've never had the opportunity to really learn this information until now. Why weren't we talking about this in high school, for example? How come we didn't talk about this in middle school? Why didn't I know this history? Or, you know, why was there so much silence? That was the conversation that I had with them. They were asking me. And when my research on racial identity development took me to schools where I was speaking to principals and teachers, I would ask them, why is it that you're sending me students that haven't had this conversation? You know, why don't you have these conversations in your school? And what I heard over and over again from educators was simply, we don't know how to have the conversation. Nobody had it with us. We don't know how to facilitate these things, that, you know, we're afraid. And so I was doing all these workshops, and I realized that it was really more than one person could do to travel around to all these different places. Maybe it was time to put what I was saying in my workshops in a book.
How'd you decide the title?
It came to me. Well, the title did come to me, and you know, you may know this story. I was on a silent retreat thinking about my life, and the book title came to me. But why did that title come to me? Because it was a question that was asked so often. When I arrived at those schools, sooner or later, the principal or somebody would say to me, and these were racially mixed schools, certainly the question would be less relevant in segregated schools, but in racially mixed schools, the first question people would often ask is, why are all the black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Yeah. Now, of course we know that the black kids are not the only ones sitting together in the cafeteria, but that is the question that was so often asked. So I wanted to answer that question and other questions that were part of those conversations about race.
Yeah, because the title of the book, everybody talks about that part of the title, but it's in other conversations about race that you are able to do and help us think through. So, you know, it's interesting that fast forward 20 years, and I'm very interested. I got a chance to read a little bit of the book in preparation for this, and it's the 20th anniversary, but in some ways, you know, it has a lot of new things. So if you've read the book before, you're going to get a copy, and so I really encourage you to read it again. But so why did you feel it was so important at this 20th anniversary to not only re-release the book, but then really add to it?
Yeah. Well, when my publisher approached me about doing a 20th anniversary edition, I thought it was a great idea. I knew I was stepping down from Spelman, a great post-presidential project, and I wasn't expecting to do as much rewriting of the book as I actually did. It truly is, in some ways, a totally new book, same title. If you've read the old version, you know that you will recognize Chapter 1, 2, and 3 is almost identical to that, but all the other chapters have been completely rewritten, not because the answer to the question is different, but because there's so much new understanding that we've learned in social science over the last 20 years. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard the phrase unconscious bias, but that research is not 20 years old. You know, that information about stereotype threads, so many ideas, the legal landscape has changed. But most importantly, I suppose, is also the demographic change. We live in a nation today that looks very different than it did from a population point of view 20 years ago. I imagine I'm not the only person in the room who was born in the 50s. And if you were born in the 50s or alive during that time, you may not have been paying attention to this statistic. I certainly wasn't back then, but the population was 90% white. Today, actually 2014 was the first year that more than half of school-age children were children of color. That's a rapid change, a rapid difference, and yet our schools are more segregated today than they were 20 years ago, and neighborhoods are as segregated. And so the work that's being done in this community around mixed income housing and presumably racially mixed housing will make some of those statistics different perhaps in the future. But we know that the history of the past is still determining much of the present.
So why is it so hard to talk about race? You do this and you have an opportunity to get a lot of perspective from a lot of people all over the country. Why is it so hard?
Well, I want to ask our audience to help me answer that question,
Right.
if I could. So I want to ask a couple of questions very quickly of this audience, and I'm going to ask each of you in your seat to think of your earliest race-related memory. And when you've thought of something, raise your hand, knowing that I'm not going to ask you to tell it. Okay, so raise your hand if you've thought of an early race-related memory. Okay, so now the question that I'd like to ask of you collectively, and you can just call out, it'll be a little chaotic, but it's okay. How old you were at the time of your memory?
4.
I heard 4, 5, 6, 8. Anybody younger than 4? Raise your hand if you were younger than 4. I've got a 3-year-old memory, and it looks like maybe somebody else does back there. Anybody with their earliest memory later than the age of 8? Okay, and so maybe middle school, high school, college, 10, yeah. How old you were really will depend on where you grew up. That makes a big difference in terms of some of these memories. But if we were to do a graph, I think we would find many people clustered around those early elementary school years, the ages we heard at the beginning, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Another question, what emotion is attached to your memory? You can call those out too. Shock. Anger. I heard somebody say happy. Sad. I heard something over here, but I didn't know what it was. Resentment. Okay, resentment, shock, anger, sadness. I did hear happy. Curious. Confusion. Anybody got confusion? Fear. No fear. We've got a couple of fears. Embarrassment. These are the words that I often hear when I ask. Sometimes guilt, but often they're words like the ones we just heard. Anger, fear, confusion, embarrassment, shock, resentment. We also sometimes hear happy. Love is a word sometimes used. Curious. Certainly love, happy are positive words, maybe in the context of a friendship or a caring relationship. Curious is kind of a neutral word, but most of those other words are words that have negative feeling attached. I mean, most of us don't want to feel angry or resentment or embarrassed or shocked or confused. And now the question I'd like to ask, and you can do this by raising your hand. Raise your hand if you discussed your experience with a caring adult, either a teacher or a parent, at the time it occurred. Okay, look around. Do you see there's a few hands up? Okay, now put your hands down, thank you. Raise your hand if you did not talk to anyone about your experience. I think if you look around, you'll see that there are many more did nots than dids, and this is always the case. I have never been in an audience where that wasn't true. And so let's go back to the fact that we're talking about 4, 5, and 6-year-olds. And if you know 4, 5, and 6-year-olds, they are pretty candid. They don't filter much, right? And so if you were 4, 5, or 6 in that early age group, and you had an unpleasant experience that was confusing or troubling in some way, and yet you didn't talk to anybody about it, even though most 4, 5, 6-year-olds are pretty candid, we have to ask the question, why not? That's counterintuitive, right? So why not? Why do you think it is the case that so many people didn't have that conversation?
I heard fear.
I heard somebody say fear. Awkward. Shame. So just those first 3 words, fear, awkward, shame. How is it that a 4, 5, or 6-year-old would already be afraid, awkward, or ashamed of this conversation? And I have to say that it lets us know, just this data right here, lets us know that most people have learned at an early age that you're not supposed to talk about race or things related to race. That you, if you notice it, you're not supposed to comment on it. If you have experienced racism, you're not, or witnessed it, you're not supposed to talk about it. And I think we get those messages at a very early age. Some people get those messages as in, this is a difficult thing that's impacting you, as in you're the target of the racism, and who are you to talk to about it? Some people get that message, I'm witnessing it and I'm not supposed to comment on it. Whether you're on the receiving end or the witnessing end, the message is the same, keep quiet. And so imagine, I'm not embarrassed to tell you, I'm 63 years old. Let's imagine your earliest memories at 3. That's 60 years, perhaps, of being in experiences or having experiences where the message is don't talk about it. So it's not a surprise that when, speaking as a psychologist in the room, when you have a lot of experience hearing that you're not, or it's not always being told directly, sometimes it's indirectly, sometimes it's shh, signaling to young children that they're not supposed to comment on these things, repeated over and over and over again, it's not surprising that as adults, we have this debilitating silence.
Sure. When I was preparing for this book, as we all know, purpose-built staff many times are traveling to our network members, and I was on a plane, and I was reading the book, and an elder white man, he was sitting next to me, and he said, so why do they? Meaning he saw quite all the... And I have used this story in the book years and years and years. It was in your first book. And it's a story about I think she's in high school.
8th grade.
8th grade, okay. So it's time for the prom. And she's in 8th grade, and she's speaking with her favorite teacher, as I remember the story, who is white. And the teacher says, are you excited about going to the prom? And she says, no, I'm not going, I'm not interested in going. And the teacher says, oh, sure you are. I know you like to dance. You all like to dance.
I know you people like to dance.
You people like to dance. Even more grading. You people like to dance. And she walks away. This is one of her favorite teachers. And she walks away hurt, kind of some of the things that you're talking about in that experience. And she goes to her white friend, as I, again, am remembering in the book. And, sort of, can you believe that I was sharing this and my teacher said this? And her friend, who is her good friend, not meaning any harm, says, you're making basically sort of too much of this, and the teacher didn't mean anything. And at that moment, that's why. To me, this is such a great example of why black kids sit together in the cafeteria. Because what she was looking for was to be affirmed that while it's not terrible and the teacher may not be racist and may never have said anything else, she wanted to be affirmed. And it's in the cafeteria that, and other places, that we are often affirmed. So talk to us a little bit of sort of that. I know you do a lot of work around racial identity, and
Yes.
share with the audience a little bit about the importance of that, because as you know, we are trying to create a cradle to college pipeline, and education and teachers, it's very important to understand some of these concepts.
Absolutely. Well, let me just start out by talking about identity. We have on the screen this sentence. It's an empty sentence. It says, I am. And if I were to ask each of you to take 60 seconds to fill in the blank, I am, think about, we're not going to actually do this, but I'm going to ask you to just think about, what would you say if somebody asked you to describe yourself? I am, fill in the blank. What would you say? You might say, I'm hungry. You might say, I am 63. You might say, I am a purpose-built network member. There are lots of things that you could say about yourself. The question is, of all the possible things, what might you include on that list? I used to ask psychology students, freshmen, first-year students in my intro psychology class, to do this on the first day of class. And what was always interesting was, along with things like I'm 18, I'm from Massachusetts, I am, fill in the blank, they would often include descriptions of group membership. I am black, I'm Puerto Rican, I am Jewish, I am a lesbian, I am fill in the blanks. But in each of these categories, it was very common for students of color to say, I am black, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm Asian American. Rarely would you have anybody write, I am white, I am European American. That was usually not mentioned. I taught for many years at a co-ed institution called Westfield State University in Massachusetts. The women would write, I am female. The men didn't write, I am male. I mentioned I am Jewish. It was unusual for someone to write, I am Protestant. They might write, I am Christian if someone was highly identified with that, but sort of denominational affiliations didn't show up. You might have a student who was brave enough to write down, I'm lesbian, or I'm gay, or I'm transgender, but I can't remember ever having a student write, I am heterosexual. Though I think it's safe to say most of them were, right? So the point here is that there are some identities that are more salient for us than others. And typically, if you have an identity in which you are targeted by that identity, as a woman targeted by sexism, as a person of color targeted by racism, you're much more likely to be tuned into that dimension of your multiple identities, we all have multiple identities, than if you are in the dominant group. And so one of the things, the first thing to say is that we all have, if we're talking about racial identity, everybody has a racial identity. Not everybody is thinking about their racial identity, right? If you are a white person living in a largely white community, working in a largely white setting, going to a largely white school, you might not think about being white at all. It might not be part of your consciousness. But if you're one of a handful of black kids in that school, I can guarantee that child is thinking about what does it mean to be black in this environment, that dimension of identity is important. If you are a white person working in a largely black community, I bet you're thinking about your whiteness when you walk into those meetings and are one of few white people in the room. So that those identities that are salient to us are the ones we focus on. And when I write about racial identity, when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is a process, a developmental process, by which people come to understand what that particular identity means in the context of a race-conscious society.
I've heard you talk about, sort of following up on that, the idea of dominant and subordinate. Talk a little bit more about that, because I think that also gives us context as we're working in our neighborhoods and we're thinking about how we show up.
Yes. Well, one of the things that I think is really important to say about dominant and subordinate categories, regardless of whether you're talking about gender or sexual orientation or race or socioeconomic status, whatever the identity category is, it's, I think, an accurate statement to say that subordinates always know more about the dominants than the dominants know about the subordinates. I'm going to repeat that. Subordinates always know more about the dominants than the dominants know about the subordinates. And there are lots of reasons why that would be true. For one thing, that if someone has power over you, you better understand who they are and how they operate in order to survive when interacting with them, right? But to use just a common example, if you are if you're a black woman working as a domestic in someone's home, you know all about them. You know what's in their closets, you know everything about how their lives are organized. They may not know anything about how your life is organized outside of that workplace. May have never been to your house, may never have been to your neighborhood, don't know anything about your children or the school they go to. And so when we think about crossing lines of difference, the first thing, if you're in a dominant category, is that you have to have some humility about the fact that you don't know very much. Often, I think one of the characteristics of being dominant is the presumption that you know a lot, right? That's part of the messaging that people get. If you're in a dominant category, part of the messaging is you're dominant because you know a lot. Or because you're smart, and so a certain kind of humility is necessary. I'm sure everyone in this audience understands that, but certainly.
Yeah, it's nice to sometimes be reminded, right? We do this work every day, and we are thinking about neighborhoods and the things that we want to do, but it's always good to remember whoever you are, and sort of that humility of we don't know.
I'm going to use an example. It's perhaps a bad example, but it just came to me. But I was thinking about, just this moment, I was thinking about our current president and Puerto Rico. And I was thinking about a tweet in which he said that people should go online and sign up for FEMA. And the ridiculous of that, because of course the conditions on the ground is that you don't have power and no internet. And so how can you go online and sign up for FEMA? But there's sort of a lack of humility in that statement. I understand what their situation is, here's what you should do.
Yeah.
And that's perhaps an exaggerated situation, but we could all imagine walking into a setting where one might say, what would I do in this situation? Well, then if it were me, I'd go online and sign up for FEMA. That's what you should do, right? Yeah. Well, it doesn't always translate in that way.
And that's a great segue because, this group is very focused on mixed income housing.
Yes.
And housing, as Carol talked about yesterday when she gave some of the statistics and as she talks about mixed income housing, policy has a lot to do with our neighborhoods and sort of where we are.
Yeah.
And I was struck in your book that this time it feels like you spent a little bit more time sharing about the history of how we got here. And I know many in the audience sort of understand a lot of that policy, but why was that important in the context of this book to share?
Yeah, well, thank you. This book is, if you've seen the earlier version, you'll notice, one of the first things you'll notice is this book is fatter. It's a longer book by about 100 plus pages, and there is more history in it. Part of that has to do with the fact that when people read the first version, they would ask me questions that let me know they didn't know much history, right? Because if you did, you wouldn't ask those questions. But I think it's really important for us to understand how we got to where we are in order to, one, not repeat the same mistakes, and two, to be thinking strategically about how to fix them. I want to use an example which is actually from outside the U.S. context. But I had the opportunity a number of years ago to visit South Africa. It was shortly after, it was around the time that the book was written the first time. It was in the late 90s. It was shortly after the end of apartheid in South Africa. And I was giving a workshop on school desegregation based on the US experience. We were sharing across cultural experiences with the South Africans who were engaged in this. And I was having a conversation with a white teacher who was a young woman in her 20s, and she was talking about the fact that when she was growing up, she asked her father, why did the black people live in these townships, which if you know anything about them, really, very impoverished conditions. And her father, who was a ranch owner and the people worked on his ranch, said they lived there because that's how they wanted to live, which of course, was such a ridiculous statement. It didn't tell her anything about the fact that people were removed from the land, were confined by law in these townships, didn't have access to come out, all of that. But that was her understanding, and so if that's your understanding, then how you would choose to solve that, fix that problem, you might say, well, there's nothing to be done, they like it that way, right? And I've heard similar kinds of conversations in the US, and maybe some of you have. And so I think it's very important for people to know, how is it that our neighborhoods got as segregated as they are? How is it, we heard yesterday about the decision to put a highway, 75 North, in the middle of a community. I think it's safe to assume that highway would never have been placed in the middle of a affluent white community. If you think about how housing policy was formed, particularly after World War II, I think it's, we are seeing the consequences of this all around the nation. But if you're wondering, what am I talking about? After World War II, the GI Bill promised these low-interest loans, housing loans, to veterans, and every veteran, theoretically, was eligible for these loans, except in practice, that wasn't the case because the loans were specifically targeted for new construction in what was then new suburban communities. Those new suburban communities, many of them were being built with very explicit racial covenants so that black people were not allowed to purchase them. So if you're a vet, let's say you're a black vet and you want a loan, you can't get one for older housing. You can only get it for new housing, but you can't buy in the new housing neighborhoods. And that's governmental policy on both ends. One is the government was subsidizing the development of those racially exclusive suburbs. The government was also establishing what we now call redlining, and it was in fact, drawing green lines around some neighborhoods, the new construction white neighborhoods, blue lines around other neighborhoods, older but still all white, yellow lines around neighborhoods that were transitioning or at risk of transitioning, and red lines around neighborhoods that were all black. And if your neighborhood has a red line around it, you can't get a loan. So you can't get a loan to buy, you can't get a loan to rehab, you can't get a loan to do any of those things. And that was official government policy in the late 40s and into the 50s. And so people were confined in areas that they couldn't invest in because they couldn't get loans and couldn't accumulate housing equity, which then helps send your kids to college, which impacts intergenerational wealth. And that's just one example. Sure. We could also talk about policies around schooling. You get out, GI Bill allows you to go to school, but you can't go to, you can get out, but can you go to schools that are segregated? You cannot. I tell the story of my dad, who was a veteran of that era, and he graduated from Howard. He was able to go to college using his GI Bill at Howard University, but Howard was not, not everyone can go to Howard, right? It's a relatively small school relative to the total population. Sure. And then, after getting his undergraduate degree and earning a master's degree in art at University of Iowa, he was teaching at Florida A&M, which is a historically black college, for those of you who don't know, in Tallahassee, and wanted to get his doctorate as a professor, needing his doctorate to advance, and could have gone to Florida State University because they offered the program that he was interested in at Florida State. But in 1954, even though it was after Brown versus Board of Education, Florida State was still segregated. And so the state of Florida, in order to meet the law of providing access, did so by paying his transportation to Pennsylvania. He went to school at Penn State. And my dad would always tell me that, the Florida didn't pay his tuition, but they paid his transportation. And so, paid his train ticket for him to get to Pennsylvania. My point being, though, that, his life would have been much easier, certainly, if he'd been able to, take a bus across town than a train to, several states away. When he finished his degree in 1957, my parents made the decision, as a lot of African Americans did, to leave the South. And I grew up in Massachusetts, where he became the first African American professor at Bridgewater State University in Massachusetts. But the point here is that all of those policy decisions, those were policy decisions. Those were federal, state, local policies that impacted people's ability to access education, access housing, ultimately access employment. And those policies and practices, even to the extent that they've been changed, are still resonating in terms of the way neighborhoods look today.
I've heard you talk about, so in working with Dr. Tatum over the years, she has a gift of words and a gift of being able to create analogies that really sort of sear in my brain some of the concepts that she talks about. And so I've heard you talk about this whole issue and thinking about it like smog.
Yes.
Talk to our audience a little bit about smog and how this relates.
I think this is a really important concept, actually, because particularly as I think about the work that all of you are doing, because if you're working across lines of difference, which of course you all are, one of the, particularly when we're dealing with issues of race, many people worry about offending someone. Will I say something that will be understood as, quote, racist? Will I say something that will reveal prejudice? Will I, somehow put my foot in it or, make things worse? And what I like to tell my students and what I write in the book is that we all get misinformation about people different from ourselves. We all get misinformation about people like ourselves, right? The fact that you're a member of a particular group doesn't mean, speaking for myself, as a black woman, doesn't mean I haven't been exposed to stereotypes about black women or about black men or, we all are exposed to these stereotypes. We've all been exposed to distorted information. And we are also, how we think about the world is also shaped by what we don't learn, by the omitted information. So it's so pervasive, I like to describe it as like breathing smog. If you walk outside today, I don't know how the air in Omaha rates against the air in Atlanta, but my guess is there's some smog. And that wherever you live, some places are smoggier than others, but wherever you live, you are going to be a smog breather. Nobody wants to describe themselves. I can guarantee that sentence, nobody wrote, I am a smog breather. But we all are. And to the extent that we're all breathing in the smog of misinformation, the smog of stereotypes, the smog of the jokes we hear people tell, the smog of the language we heard people using as we grew up, the smog of the inaccurate information that people share, we are likely, if you breathe it in, sooner or later you're going to breathe some out. And so the issue should not be, am I ever going to breathe out some smog? You will. It's guaranteed. But the question is not that. The question is, what are we doing to clean up the air? How are we working to try to improve the situation?
Yeah, I want to.
It won't be perfect.
I want to read just a couple of things out of your book. One was written by a student who was a white woman, and I think it sort of echoes this. And I'm reading these two passages as a prelude to a question of how do you help people have conversations? And then I would say that we're going to open up to questions. So if you have a question, you can begin to think about that, and we have mics in the audience for you to come to be able to ask Dr. Tatum a few things. So the first passage that I will read is, as I said, from this white woman in your class. She was in her late 30s. And she wrote this about her fears when trying to speak honestly about her understanding of racism. And she says, "Fear requires us to be honest with not only others, but with ourselves. Often, this much honesty is difficult for many of us, for it would permit our insecurities and ignorance to surface, thus opening the floodgates for our vulnerabilities. This position is difficult for most of us when we are in the company of entrusted friends and family. I can imagine fear heightening when we are in company of those we hardly know. Hence, rather than publicly admit our weaknesses, we remain silent. And then you have a passage from an Asian American that was also in your class about the difficulty of speaking. And I thought that this was really also key, because I think a lot of times people feel as though if you are a person of color or you're in that subordinate group, it is easy for you to sort of be vocal and to be able to share things. So this woman writes, the process of talking about this issue is not easy. We people of color can't always make it easier for white people to talk about race relations, because sometimes they need to break away from that familiar and safe ground of being neutral or silent. I understand that some are trying, but sometimes they need to take bigger steps and more risk. As an Asian in America, I am always taking risks when I share my experiences of racism. However, the dominant culture expects it of me. They think I like talking about how my parents were laughed at work, or how my older sister is forced to take birth control pills because she's on welfare. Even though I'm embarrassed and sometimes get too emotional about these issues, I talk about them because I want to be honest about how I feel. So I have a white friend who is doing a lot of reading and sort of with what's happening in the environment. What advice would you give to her when she wants to enter into these conversations in a way that, even if she's fearful, she's able to enter in?
Well, I think that it's important, as both of them, actually both the white student and the Asian student, talked about taking risks, right? And I think we all have to be willing to risk some discomfort in order to really engage in meaningful dialogue. I write a lot in the book about the importance of dialogue, and I do think that it makes a difference. However, I think it's also important to say that dialogue is not a one-shot experience, right? Sometimes people will bring folks together for a, quote, conversation, but it's time limited and it's a one-time event, and usually that's just enough to make people uncomfortable, as opposed to enough to really work through anything, right? So that one of the things I really enjoyed about my class was that it was 15 weeks, right? And so there was a guarantee that we'd have a hard conversation this week, but next week we'll all be back and do it again. And over time, it would eventually get easier. And while not everybody's going to sign up for a class for 15 weeks, people can sign up to say, for the next 4 weeks, we're going to meet and talk about this, or we're going to make a commitment to have a book club. We're going to read something together and talk about it, which is actually a great way to do it because it gives structure to the conversation. But there are resources that are available from organizations like what used to be called study circles. Now I think it's called Democracy Now! Or something like that. But there are organizations that provide conversation guides that can be helpful. But the commitment to coming back, even if it's, we're going to talk today, and even if I've said something that offends you or you said something that offends me, if we've made a commitment to come back the following week, it gives time for reflection and re-engagement. And I think that that's really a critical component, that opportunity to go away, think about it, and come back. I have another analogy that I'm going to share here, which is to say conversations about race are kind of like antibiotics, which is to say they work well if you take the whole dose. But what happens if you don't take the whole dose, right? The illness comes back, and it comes back worse. And I actually think that that's where we are as a society right now. People will say we talk about it all the time. Actually not. We have had some conversations, but we've never taken the whole dose. And that's why, the partial conversations are enough to raise people's anxiety. And what do people do when they have high anxiety? They either lash out or they avoid. And we see evidence of both things happening. A lot of lashing out and a lot of avoidance.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, very powerful and very important for the work that we do, is thinking that it is not a one-time thing. It is not just we have the conversation and then we don't talk about it anymore, but we have to figure out how we continue to have the conversation. And many of our network members are spending time thinking about those things and having those conversations. So I'm going to open it.
I want to
Yes,
say something else.
absolutely.
Actually, we are going to open it, but while you're thinking about the question you want to ask, let me just say this. One of the things that I think is really important, and this is particularly for the white people in the audience, you know, I know that because I've had all this experience teaching about racism, I know that one of the reasons white people don't like to talk about it is because it makes them feel bad. You know, that there's a sense of guilt or sometimes shame or embarrassment, even if it's not your history, right? Even if you arrived here from someplace else yesterday. The idea that this has been happening and that white people that you might be connected to have somehow participated in it, or you yourself have been participating in it, is hard for people to hear. And so if we don't talk about it, I don't have to think about it. And, you know, and one of those ideas that goes along with this is the idea of privilege, right? I am sure many people in this audience have heard the phrase white privilege or male privilege or white male privilege or, you know, white male heterosexual privilege, you know, or class privilege. I mean, privilege is a fact. It's not an insult, you know, and sometimes when someone is told they have privilege, they respond in a very defensive way because it makes it sound like, you know, if someone said to me, you've got heterosexual privilege. I identify as heterosexual. Or I grew up in a middle-class family. You have class privilege. Those things are true. Those are true statements. It's not that I'm a bad person or somehow have been misusing other people or abusing other people because privilege is part of my experience. But if you have it, you have it. It's just a fact. And so I think it's important for people to own it and then figure out how to leverage it. If you've got it, you can use it to make a difference. And of course, the people in this room are doing that hard work in communities where the privilege of social networks, the privilege of access to capital, the privilege of resources helps you to do that work, obviously. But I find that particularly in this political climate, the idea that someone has, quote, privilege is somehow being talked about as though this is a ridiculous concept. You know, it's not ridiculous, it's real. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, it just means that's part of your life experience that you should acknowledge.
Yeah. So, I'm turning to the audience, and are there some people that have some questions for Dr. Tatum? If so, I see one mic is here. If you just come to the mic so that we can hear you, that would be great.
Hi, Nikki Beasley from Northern California. I really appreciate your insight. And can you share, as either parents in the room or those in the education system, how we can be more proactive in listening to our children's voices? Because the educational system that we are probably all familiar with is a lot different. So how can we pick up the signs with our children who may be dealing with these issues that we're not aware of?
Yes, well, so in my book, I talk a lot about examples from children, the kinds of questions that children ask, even starting at a very young age, as young as preschool. Kids are having experiences and talking about race, sometimes in ways that make adults uncomfortable, but if we're listening carefully, we will hear those things. I often talk, when I'm talking to educators, and I would say the same to parents, that there are three things that I think we should all be thinking about. I call them the ABCs. A stands for affirming identity, B stands for building community, C stands for cultivating leadership. And so I want to highlight in particular the A, affirming identity. And so I want you to imagine with me, let's imagine there's a photographer in the room, which there is, but let's imagine there's a photographer up here on the stage taking a group photo of all of you. And let's imagine that each person could see, each person's going to get a copy. The people closer to the front of the room are more likely to be visible in the picture than the people far in the back. But let's imagine that you were positioned so that everybody theoretically could be seen in the picture. When you get a copy of this photo, what is the first thing you're going to do with it? Look for yourself. That is the only answer to this question. You're going to look for yourself. And let's imagine that you're sitting right in the front row. You should certainly be visible in this photo. But let's imagine you're right up front, you're looking for yourself in the picture, but you've been digitally removed from it. So you've gotten this picture and you're looking for yourself, but you're not in it. And so you would ask yourself, what's wrong with this picture, right? What's wrong with this picture? But let's imagine that you come every year to the Purpose-Built Conference, and every year, before you go to the break, before people head for the bathrooms or whatever, they say, stay in your seats, please, we're going to do a group photo. Every year, when you sit in the front, you get your picture back, every year they've digitally removed you. I don't know how many times it would take, but I can guarantee you eventually somebody's going to say, stay for the picture, and you're going to say, I'm out of here. Why would I hang around? I'm never in the picture. You know, why would I invest in this activity? I'm not included. When we think about schools, what we can say, schools, workplaces, any organization of which we're a part, when we walk into those spaces, one of the first things we do is look for ourselves in them. And we look to see not only are we represented, imagine the picture, not only do you look for yourself, but then you look to see if you're looking good, right? You want to see yourself in the picture and you want to see yourself looking good. And so when we think about schools, the first question we have to ask is, which kids see themselves represented and how are they represented? If you are a black child and you're only represented when they're talking about slavery, or you're only represented when you're talking about how people were, abused on the Pettus Bridge, while that is important information, where is the information about resistance to oppression? Where is the information that gives you a sense of agency? Where's the information that speaks to the contributions that people who look like you have made? That's part of the affirmation of identity. So as a parent, certainly one of my goals was to always go into the school and see how kids like mine were being represented in the school. That's number one. And certainly teachers and those who are thinking about curriculum need to be thinking about that. That information, that idea, though, that everybody wants to see themselves represented and looking good is important also when we talk about white children, because we want, particularly when we're talking about race and issues related to racism, everybody wants to see themselves in the picture and looking good, right? So if we only talk about white people relative to racism as agents of racism, as opposed to allies, then we don't give white children a place to see themselves in a positive way. So both things are important. We need to create opportunities for kids of color to see themselves as resisting oppression, learning about slave rebellions, for example, learning about agency, but we also want to create models for white children who can learn about people who have resisted being oppressors, who have been advocates for social change and social justice. And so that's important too. And, parents should be asking, where are those examples in my child's schooling? That's the A. The B, building community, means how do we create a shared sense of community where everybody can be involved and engaged? And if we're doing the work around the A, the B is much easier. You can't get people to do the B if you haven't done your homework around the A. And then the C, about cultivating leadership, is thinking about the fact that this generation, more than half of which are children of color, are the next leaders. And so what are we doing for all of our children, regardless of whether they are white or children of color, to prepare them to engage effectively across lines of difference? I'm going to give you a statistic which I found really interesting. It's in the book. There was a survey done in 2013 of social networks. 75% of white people have entirely white social networks, meaning they don't know anybody who's not white. And if that's your experience, you are not going to be well prepared to deal with a society that is going to be a pluralistic society. So learning how to cross lines of difference is a critical part of developing leadership.
Based on the comment that you just made in reference to the 75%, and the comment in reference to making the commitment to come back to the conversation.
Yes.
What are some of the things that you can use to convince that group to come back, considering what would be the benefits. What are the benefits for me coming back to this conversation? What are the benefits of me leaving out of my 75% comfortable zone to come back and discuss and deal with these difficult challenges?
Well, what I have found to be the most useful way, well, sometimes it's helpful to encourage or require the commitment up front before the discomfort starts, right? To say, I mean, as your doctor, I'm going to use that analogy, right? You come, you want to have a conversation because you're hurting in some way. You go to see the doctor because you've got an ear infection, in some way. And he says or she says, I can help you with that, but here's what you have to do. You've got to take 2 weeks of this medicine you don't particularly like, but you got to do it, 14 days, right? And so if at the beginning we say, this conversation can help you, I happen to know it can help you because I've had lots of them. And maybe even if you can get personal testimonies from people who've done it, who've said, I did it and it really made a difference for me. Working with teachers was a wonderful experience when I had the opportunity to work with teachers who then at the end of the 15 weeks were so excited by the conversation that they wanted to train their peers. They became peer leaders, peer mentors in their building. And they could say, yes, you will be uncomfortable. Yes, there'll be times when you don't want to come back. But I'm here to tell you that 14 days later, your ear feels better, right? And your ear infection is not likely to return. So you can, I like to name the problem up front. Yes, there are going to be times when this conversation's uncomfortable. There are going to be times when you don't want to come back. That's why we've asked everybody to make a commitment. I can tell you that it will be better. It does get better. And there are examples, and you can read about those examples, and we can talk about them, and people can come and tell us how they did it in their communities. But it's really about knowing that it might feel uncomfortable, and yet the end result will be positive.
So Bernard from Woodlawn Foundation in Birmingham. I have to ask you this question, having been the president of one of the most prestigious HBCUs in the country. Given Brown versus Board of Education and how the Kennedy administration enforced that across the southeastern United States, what negative effects do you think that had on HBCUs, on the broader African American community, and is there anything now that you think we should be doing in response to some of those things that may have negatively happened?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most negative things about Brown versus Board of Education was the widespread displacement of African American teachers. So that when schools were desegregated in the places where they were, and mostly that was in the South, I have to say that whatever progress was made towards school desegregation largely occurred in the South as a result of court orders. In the most segregated schools today are in the Northeast. And those schools, I grew up in Massachusetts. Boston had a horrible experience around school desegregation. And, a combination of white flight and resistance has left those schools more segregated than ever in some parts of the states, and generally speaking. And even in the South, where there was school desegregation, there, to a certain extent, again, supported by the federal government, in the last 20 years, those supports have been chipped away by Supreme Court decisions that have essentially left Brown versus Board of Education pretty meaningless, to be perfectly honest. So, which is why schools are more segregated today than they were 20 years ago. All of that to say, however, back in the 50s, when schools were being combined, typically what that meant was the black teachers who were teaching in those black schools were laid off and replaced by white teachers, many of whom were hostile to the children they were teaching. And so the fact that you have teachers who are hostile towards you, have low expectations about you, all of that contributes to negative school experience and performance. And that is, I think, one of the direct results of some of the legacy of Brown. That said, one of the things that it can be really beneficial, I am certainly an advocate for Spelman College, a historically black college for women. Before being at Spelman, I was for many years at Mount Holyoke College, which is a women's college, not historically black. But the point I'm about to make is that, women's education, HBCUs, provide a very valuable service in higher education. Not everyone is going to go to a women's college, not everyone's going to go to an HBCU. And one of the strengths of higher education is the diversity of opportunities. There's many different kinds of schools to choose from. But I think we would all agree that access to education is critical, and that being able to, and I'm actually giving a speech about this tomorrow morning in another setting, colleges and universities are one of the few places in the United States where there's an opportunity for people from different backgrounds to connect across lines of difference. And if we don't take full advantage of those opportunities, we will have missed, I think, a very important moment in the development of the next generation of leaders.
Good morning. My name's Evan. Thank you for sharing your perspective with us this morning. Your comment about meaningful conversations really resonates with me. It feels like a lot of things that I've seen lately have been signaling. I'm talking especially about social media, where people, post something and they're not really engaging in a meaningful way. What's your suggestion about, how to create space and encourage people to begin to dialogue, especially in those moments where, I'm thinking especially when maybe I'm with family or friends, and there seems like there could be space to have a conversation. How do you begin to have conversations and invite people into it? That seems to be quite different than signing up for a class, for example, where you're committing to do something for a longer duration.
I'm going to give you a strategy, which I think is a really useful one, particularly for family and friends. Let's imagine you're all having dinner together, and someone says something that you really want to respond to. And you're wondering, should I open this can of worms? Should I go down that road? What will this mean? And here's a strategy that I have found can be quite useful. And it's a method I call FFF, the 3F method. And before you jump to any conclusions, I will let me just say, it doesn't have anything to do with the middle finger, okay? The FF method is simply this: felt, found, feel, right? So let's imagine someone who you are connected with, a family member. You share identities in common, right? And that person says something, maybe tells a joke or makes a comment or says, like that woman in South Africa, well, they live there because they want to, clearly not knowing that history. You could say, I felt that way, if you ever did, right? There was a time when I thought that was true. I found out this thing. I read that book. I went to that session. I saw this on television. I found out this new information. I've been working in that community, and I now feel, fill in the blank. And what is important about that is you never say, you're an idiot, right? And they follow along with you, and essentially you're taking them on your learning journey, which hopefully opens the door and models for somebody else what their learning journey might be, and maybe they'll ask you more questions about it, and the next thing you know, you're having that conversation. You might say, and I want to include this because sometimes people say something that is so outrageous that you would never want to say, I felt that way. You know what I mean? You would never want to own that, and maybe you never in fact did. Here's a variant on that. I know many people feel that way, but I found, and so you can still use the same strategy, and I found that to be a really helpful way to get a conversation started. That's it's not very, generally speaking, not too threatening.
Top of the morning to everyone in here. I see you have on your book Kids, and that's what I'm most interested in. And one of the things, and one of the stories I want to tell you is that I stay at a predominantly black neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I went out to the recreation center one morning, and the pre-kids was there. And when I walked in, the first said, good morning to everybody. I didn't get no response. So one of the things, if there are any teachers in here, because my father beat it in me. He didn't have to tell me beat it in me. I had to be polite in everywhere I go. So one of the things that need to be is the respect. Good morning, good afternoon, and how you doing, sir? And you all have a blessed day. Thank you for letting me share.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we are winding down. I want to give you the final word, and if we could sort of do that by me asking you the question. This year in Purposeful, I've read a lot. There's a lot of things I knew, and there's a lot of things I've learned. And I have to say, sometimes I'm just overwhelmed. Mm-hmm. I look at the work that this group is doing in neighborhoods, and it's disheartening sometimes and exhilarating. I look at the political climate, and as Evan said, sometimes the conversations that we're having are very discouraging and distressing. So I know you are an optimistic person. And what would you say to that person that says, I struggle with sometimes being optimistic about how we're going to move forward, and has there been progress?
Yes. Well, progress is 2 steps forward. Often, in my understanding of history, I see progress as often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not linear, right? It's not like moving ahead. There's always forward motion, backward push, and certainly I think many people would say we're in a backward push moment right now. And in that context, I like to say, in times of darkness, we all have to generate more light. And in thinking about, well, how do I generate light? I like to say, think about your sphere of influence. Everybody has a sphere of influence. Somebody has, some people have bigger spheres than others, but we all influence, whether it's family members or friends or the people we're working with in our organization or members of our worship communities or civic organizations. We all influence other people in some way. And if you think about what your sphere of influence is and how you're using it, you're going to be able to make an impact within that sphere. And you never know how that sphere is going to impact some other sphere. So, starting with your own sphere of influence is a place I always say begin, because you have control over that. And so that's something that you don't have to wait for anybody else to do. We all are leaders in that sense, and so we have to exercise our own leadership. I heard Kamala Harris speaking. My church in Atlanta was celebrating its 150th anniversary on Sunday, and she was the invited speaker. And she said something that I thought was definitely worth remembering. She said, if you're feeling discouraged, this is not a time to throw up your hands. It's a time to roll up your sleeves. And so I think that that's really what I want to leave you all with. We all have to roll up our sleeves in our sphere of influence and use it.
Thank you so much, Dr.